Hey, RetconRaider here. Today I thought we'd take a quick look at another crowdfunded strategy game that was just released through Steam's Early Access program. Today I thought we'd talk about Star Trader Frontiers by Trese Brother Games. So, what is Star Trader Frontiers? Well, it's a turn-based roguelite RPG with a heavy focus on simulating things like crew management, ship management, and interfaction diplomacy. Star Trader Frontiers is your classic Kickstarter success story, reaching its initial crowdfunding goal back in August of 2014. While it's certainly struggled with the usual array of delays that come with most crowdfunded indie development projects, it's finally been released into the wild just over 3 years later. Now, it is worth mentioning that the original project pitched on Kickstarter was a little bit different than the product we ended up with. Certain mechanics, such as the modular shipbuilding system and the wilderness exploration system, have changed significantly throughout development, but today I'll be focusing on the game we actually got, rather than what it could have been. That said, let's get started. Star Trader Frontiers takes place in the fairly well-established Star Trader universe, a setting which Trese Brother Games has used in several of their previous titles, including both their Star Trader series as well as their Templars series. Chronologically, Frontiers takes place after the events of the other games, set in the distant far-fallen Rim, where the ancient trading empires have once again found themselves locked in a constant struggle for power and riches. The player takes on the role of a fledgling star trader who has just inherited his first ship and a low-level trade permit. The player is tasked with creating their captain, assembling a crew for their ship, and then taking to the stars as they try to make a living in a universe filled with political intrigue and infinite dangers. The player starts the game by building their captain, either by selecting a pre-made character template or by using the game's priority-based character building system. This will allow the player to prioritize whatever they think the most important aspect of their new captain should be, choosing from 5 categories, including attribute points, skills, experience levels, and even the spaceship and network of contacts that the player will begin the game with. This forces the player to prioritize between short and long-term benefits. After all, the player can theoretically gain experience levels, buy larger ships, and meet new contacts over time as they play the game, but starting the game with those things makes it much easier for the player to get established. Inversely, the player will have a much harder time gaining attributes and skill levels, but starting with those things means the player will also have to start with a less experienced crew, a smaller support network, and a smaller ship, which in turn means they'll have a much harder time during the early portion of the game. After that, the player is given the opportunity to determine a few other details about their character, such as their name, gender, and appearance, as well as which faction they'll begin the game allied with. Then the player is thrust into a largely uncaring universe with little in the way of explanation for the game's many complex mechanics. Star Trader Frontiers can be very unforgiving. It uses a single rolling autosave slot to track the player's progress, and a single bad trading run can quickly result in bankruptcy, mutiny, or even death. It's a constant uphill struggle as the player is faced with an endless torrent of expenses. Their ship needs to be maintained, their crew needs to be paid, and both their fuel tanks and their cargo holds need to be filled. The player can certainly eke out a living running basic trade routes, but more lucrative goods require special permits to transport, and the player can only get those by carefully building up their reputation with different factions and then performing special favors for their business contacts. But it's not all trading. More adventurous players can touch down on alien planets and explore the wilderness, tracking down untapped caches of valuable trading goods, or inadvertently stumbling into combat with hostile smugglers or alien pests. More bloodthirsty players can turn a profit by roaming through space, hunting down pirates and smugglers, or perhaps even becoming one themselves. More subtle players may instead decide to try their luck in the roiling cesspit of interplanetary politics, acting as a freelance spy as they steal secrets from one faction and sell them to another, potentially influencing the outcome of events on a galactic level. Players seeking a more structured approach to politics may instead decide to approach their contacts on various planets, accepting missions that can end up pitting them directly against other factions. As the player explores the sprawling galaxy around them, they'll slowly build up a reputation with the various factions that occupy the far-fallen rim, and they'll quickly discover that many of their actions will have consequences. While it's theoretically possible to micromanage your captain's reputation, Star Trader Frontiers has an impressive number of variables and moving parts. Sometimes it's easy for the player to anticipate the potential consequences of their actions. Attacking a ship, for example, even a pirate or smuggler, will anger whatever faction that ship is part of. Trading away of faction secrets or smuggling goods into their territory will obviously anger that faction if the player is caught doing it. But unless the player can constantly keep their thumb on the pulse of the intergalactic community, represented by the game's rumor system, they're bound to make a mistake sooner or later, accidentally breaking a trade embargo or providing material support to a rival faction, and that means making enemies. As the player starts making enemies, they'll find themselves unwelcome on certain planets or in certain parts of the galaxy. In more extreme cases, they may even find themselves being chased down by bounty hunters, or even openly attacked by a hostile faction's military. And even if the player somehow manages to stay on everyone's good side, they'll still have to contend with independent threats such as pirates, scavengers, and hostile alien life forms. So no matter how the player approaches the game, conflict is inevitable, and this is handled in a somewhat simplistic but highly lethal turn-based combat system. Crew-level battles are handled in a fashion somewhat similar to games like Darkest Dungeon, with 4 versus 4 battles based around careful positioning and heavy use of special abilities. Both sides in a battle are lined up in a row of 4, with different weapons and abilities requiring a character to stay in certain positions in the battle line. During these battles, it's vital for the player to monitor both the health and morale of their crew. If a crewman's morale gets too low, then they'll begin suffering severe penalties, and they may even abandon ship the next time the player makes port. If their health gets too low, then they may end up getting knocked out of a fight, which will usually result in being temporarily incapacitated, but may also result in that crewman permanently dying. Ship-to-ship combat is even more heavily abstracted. Each turn, the player will need to make multiple tactical decisions, first deciding if they want to advance on their opponent or retreat and attempt to flee, which in turn will determine their range from the enemy's ship on a turn-by-turn basis. And range is what determines which weapons and tactics they can make use of. Putting enough distance between 2 ships will allow the player to flee, while moving 2 ships closer together may allow one or both of them to mount breaching actions, crew-to-crew combat that can quickly result in the capture or destruction of one or both ships. The player will also need to decide how to allocate their reactor points, which are used to power both their ship's engines as well as their weapon systems. Finally, the player can also make use of 1 tactical ability per turn. These special abilities are based on the talents learned by the player's captain and crew, and they can quickly turn the tide in battle. Every tactical ability comes with an assortment of useful effects, quickly repairing damage, bolstering crew morale, buffing the player's weapons or defensive systems, or debuffing the opponent. Just like with the player's weapon systems, it's imperative to know when and where to use each ability to maximize the player's chances of victory. Ship-to-ship combat can quickly make or break a player's campaign. Even if the player is victorious, every hit their ship suffers can wreak havoc on internal components, destroy expensive cargo, or even kill valuable members of their crew. It can be difficult to recover from that sort of damage, even under the best of circumstances, and if the player is unlucky enough to suffer a catastrophic hull breach, well, then that's it. Their ship is destroyed and they die along with the rest of their crew. Game over. The game uses a similarly harsh and abstract resolution system for many of the other risky actions that a player might take, usually in the form of a fairly intriguing event card system. This card-based system is used to resolve many actions, including things like exploring the wilderness, patrolling hostile space, blockading enemy planets, spying on faction communications, and accessing the black market. Each time the player attempts one of these actions, the game will randomly draw 5 cards from an appropriate card deck, with the exact chance of good or bad cards being determined by a number of contributing factors, such as planetary conditions or the player's skills and attributes. The player can manipulate this card system in certain ways, most notably through the use of special crew skills, which will sometimes allow the player to redraw, discard, or even outright ignore the results of certain undesirable cards. Beyond that, there are dozens of other mechanics to master and moving parts to keep track of, and if the player wants to be successful, then they'll need to learn how to juggle the game's numerous systems. The player will need to carefully cultivate their crew towards their preferred playstyle, hiring crewmen from 24 different classes and training them in over 100 different active and passive abilities. Every crewman is randomly generated using the same system that the player used to make their captain, and the player can even change their names and appearances if they want to. But each randomly generated crewman also has a set of secret background and personality traits that can end up hurting or helping the player in the long run, so the player needs to be ready to replace crewmen who have outlived their usefulness, or crewmen who inevitably die in the line of duty. The player also needs to get used to carefully managing their ship's systems, upgrading or swapping out parts to suit their needs, while keeping in mind that more expensive components may perform better, but will also be more expensive to maintain and repair over time. The player will need to chart out profitable trade routes, keeping in mind that relying too heavily on a single route will deplete or oversaturate local markets, and that certain goods may require special permits to sell in certain regions of space. Random events may temporarily shift the demand for certain types of products, and political or military conflicts may make it impossible to deal with one faction without angering another. Overall, I'll admit, I was caught off guard by just how complex this game can get, especially since it's a game primarily aimed at a mobile audience. While a lot of the mechanics seem deceptively simple on the surface, there are a lot of things to keep track of, and the game is designed to make sure the player is forced to deal with the consequences of even the most innocent mistake. Personally, it took me 4 hours and 3 separate captains to figure out the game's basics, and even now I often end up second-guessing myself when confronted with any significant risk. It makes for a fairly unique and unforgiving experience, which may or may not appeal to the average player. As with most games based around trade and diplomacy, Star Trader Frontiers is a naturally slow-paced game, but it's also one that can end in the blink of an eye, with a single critical misstep instantly destroying hours or even days of hard work. It can be exhilarating to prevail against all odds, but it can also be incredibly frustrating to see your entire ship and crew literally falling to pieces all around you. Visually, the game is, well, it's serviceable. Like I said before, it's a game that was designed with mobile devices in mind, so it's mostly menus and buttons, with only the occasional piece of art to help illustrate the galaxy you're interacting with. While the player's captain and crew can be customized to a certain extent, the number of visual options are relatively limited, at least for now, so the player will inevitably encounter many people with identical faces and outfits as they explore the galaxy. Likewise, the audio is also serviceable. The music is nice enough, but there are only a few tracks in the game, and those are mostly just intended to set the basic mood. Outside of combat, sound effects are almost non-existent, but to be fair, given that the game is mostly a menu-based trade and travel simulator, with occasional bouts of card or turn-based carnage mixed in, sound effects are probably a pretty low priority. And of course, it's critically important to remember that this game is currently in early access. Although the sheer number of mechanics can make it easy to forget, the game is unfinished. The player can wander the galaxy, growing rich and famous to their heart's content, but at the moment the game's main storyline is only about 20% complete. It's also clear that the user interface still needs a lot of work, and things like tooltips and tutorials are almost completely non-existent, making an already complex game even harder to figure out. And, as with most early access products, Star Trader Frontiers is also occasionally prone to bugs or crashes. Although it does seem a lot more stable than your average early access game, I've personally run into some odd behavior here and there, ranging from relatively harmless math errors to the occasional crash to desktop. But for what it's worth, the autosave system works quite admirably, and I've never actually lost any progress due to a crash. It's also worth mentioning that the developers seem committed to consistently improving the game. Star Trader Frontiers has only been out for a few days, and the developers have already released 2 small patches, addressing bugs, streamlining the user interface, and even adding in a bit of new content, including 2 new mid-ranged combat ships designed for bounty hunters or military officers on a budget. I'm already pretty impressed by the game in its current state, but I'm eager to see what else the developers have planned for it as development moves forward. While I generally don't think it's fair to review games that are still under active development, for now I'd at least say that Star Trader Frontiers is definitely worth checking out, provided you're the sort of player who actually enjoys slow-paced menu-heavy trading simulators, and you don't mind dealing with what amounts to a mandatory Iron Man mode. Personally, I actually ended up falling in love with it pretty quickly, and I ended up having to force myself to stop playing it after I realized it was 3 in the morning and I'd been playing it for almost 10 hours straight. So if you think this looks like the sort of game that you might be interested in, I encourage you to go check it out. You can find out more about Star Trader Frontiers on the official website or the store page on Steam. Links are in the description.